You're likely in a good mood. I'm going to ask you to do a couple of things with me here this morning. And the first one is to simply answer this question. It may seem like a loaded question, because it is. And the question is this: how many of you, by show of hand, like and embrace change in your life? Okay. Put your hands down. If you hesitate putting your hand up, you do not like or embrace change, right? So I'm going to ask you again. How many of you here like or embrace change? Show of hands. Okay, keep them up. Because put them down. The experiment actually was, I'm looking around to see not only A, how many hands went up, but B, what the response of the person next to you actually was. Because that's the real answer. I was looking for how many eye rolls and no way do they like change. I know them. They want meatloaf on Tuesday. And if meatloaf is not served on Tuesday, life is over as we know it, right? And so that's fair. It's a reality. You know, many people don't like and embrace change. Studies actually tell us that typically our initial response to a change when first presented to us is actually to resist it. Is actually say, no, why would I want to change something that I like, something that I'm comfortable with, something that may or may not be working for me? Why would I do that? And so just to kind of show you a little bit of the dynamics of what sometimes change can feel like, just two real simple exercises. The first thing I want you to do is just, as you normally would, don't overthink this, cross your arms. Just cross your arms. Okay, there we go. Now uncross your arms and cross them the other way, the way you normally wouldn't do it. Okay, I see some of you looking down and we're crossing our arms, people. It's not the hardest thing, right? But a simple movement like that is kind of, now you can cross them back to how you normally like them, okay? Right? It's a small movement. It's a little bit uncomfortable. It's well, this doesn't feel normal. This doesn't feel natural. I want to go back to how it is. Okay, let's try one more. Just kind of cross your hands together and overlap your thumbs, however you would normally. Just do that however you normally. Just rest it on there. Okay. Now uncross and do it the other way. Yeah, we want thumbs on top of thumbs, right? All right, you can cross your hands, you can fold your arms however you wanted to do. What I really wanted to do was make everyone get up and change seats, but I wasn't quite sure how that was going to go over this morning. If you can't even cross your arms, that's like a pro step, right? So, but it shows the fact that oftentimes we don't like change. Oftentimes change is difficult. But we live in a world and we see things changing around us, things that we can't necessarily stop the change, right? A lot of times it's hairstyles or how we dress. Some of you are resisting that change quite well, actually, right? Other things we see in terms of technology. You know, I was thinking over the last 10 years, just the way in which the phones have changed, right? Do you remember the flip phone, right? And how annoying it was to text on the flip phone. And then when the swipe phones came out, you thought, well, I'm not going to do this. But then you embraced the change and you saw the difference. And you see it changing over and over and over again. But what if it's about things that we actually have some control over? That it's not our culture, it's not society, it's not technology telling us that you need to get on board or you're going to be left behind. What about those areas and those elements of life when we have the choice, we have the vote, that I can either change or remain the same? What will we do? And perhaps the better question is, in those circumstances and those situations where we are comfortable, where it does seem natural and normal for us, maybe the better question to ask is, why would I change in the first place? Why would I change? Why would I even consider that? This summer we're doing a series called Life Swap. And it's this idea of there may be certain characteristics in our life that we would like to swap out, that we would like to change, that we would like to see different in our lives. And oftentimes it may be a little bit more obvious because we're swapping out something that we don't like with something that we wish we had more of. For example, if we struggle with self-control, then we want to swap that out to gain more control. Or maybe if we struggle with bitterness and anger, we want to swap that out in order to have forgiveness in our life. Those seem kind of obvious because we're swapping out something bad for something good. This morning, I want to talk about the necessity of change. Because essentially, change is asking you to swap out something that is good for something that's even greater. And oftentimes, we fail to change because our focus is so caught up in what we are currently doing that we fail to make the change in order for something greater. And I believe that something greater is to have a continued influence in the midst of life. That I think one of the best reasons why we make change in life is because we are willing to sacrifice and change our preference for a greater sense of influence. And if we're unwilling to sacrifice or to change our preferences, we'll oftentimes not only lose influence in whatever sphere of life that is, we run the risk of becoming irrelevant. Let me just give you two real quick examples. How many of you, by a show of hands, know or have heard of Netflix? How many of you were on Netflix this weekend? Right? Majority of you. Okay, show of hands. In the last 3 years, how many of you have visited a Blockbuster video store? Okay, we've got a couple of hands, right? A couple of hands. But they are no longer around. I heard the last Blockbuster video store has actually just closed. Do you know that 10 years ago, a little startup company called Netflix approached the big heavyweight called Blockbuster, and this was at the peak of their situation. They had more stores open than ever before. They had higher revenues than ever before. And these dudes from Netflix showed up and said, hey, we have an idea. People are never going to want to stop watching movies, but the method is going to change. And they said, we think people are going to want to stream at their home movies through their computers. Now, I wasn't in the meeting with Blockbuster, but I understood it sort of went along this lines. No, that's crazy, right? And as I started to think about it, I started to think of it's an old method. Of course, people are always going to want the method of leaving their comfortable home, of going to a store, of trying to figure out what they want to watch, and then realize that that video they wanted to watch has actually already been rented. And then if there's a chance that the movie is that they wanted to watch, they get to go home and watch it. They then forget about the movie for a couple of days, and now they're paying triple for the movie they only really wanted to watch once. Really? The method would change? And so Netflix offered to Blockbuster that they could buy them out for $10 million. That was the offer on the table to Blockbuster. $10 million and you can have our idea. You can have it all. And Blockbuster flat out said no. 18 months later, Blockbuster went bankrupt because they failed to see the importance of making a change. They failed to see the importance of understanding that influence is oftentimes more important than method. Now, you may be sitting there this morning thinking, okay, well, that's a great corporate example. I can tell someone else this tomorrow, but what difference does it make? You see, I believe that in our own lives, we are actually putting this practice into place. That we are actually making changes in our life about things that matter to us because we value the importance of influence. Think of in any sphere you walk in. If you want to make a difference, whether it's at work, whether it's school, whether it's on a sports team, whether it's in your community, whether it's your family, if you want to make a difference, if you want to not run the risk of becoming irrelevant, you're going to have, at times, make changes. Let me give you an example from my own life. As dad, as a father, I want to have an influence upon my kids. I want to be able to speak into their lives. I want to be building a relationship. And what I've realized over the years is that in order for that to happen, I must be willing to sacrifice many of my preferences for their sake. The one example I'll use is in terms of how we have fun, how we spend our recreational time. About 13 years ago, 12 years ago, my kids loved to go to the park. They loved to go down the slide, they loved to be pushed on the swing, they loved to play in the sand, and they loved to play this game called Chase. You've probably seen it, you've probably done it. That's where you as the adult chase your kid around the playground like a crazy person, and they absolutely love it. Question, do you think that was my preference? Do you think I went up to my kids and said, hey, who's up for a game of Chase, right? Heck no. You go to any park and you see a parent playing Chase with their kids, it's not the parent who suggested it, it's likely the kid. I was having to give up my preferences in order to have influence, in order to build a relationship with them. Well, guess what? Fast forward 10 years down the road. If I go to my kids today, my oldest is 14, and say, hey, Isaac, you want to have a rousing game of Chase? He's like, oh, Dad, you're so embarrassing, right? What happens now is we go mountain biking, we jump on the trampoline, and we play mini sticks until our knees are raw, right? Getting closer, but still not in my wheelhouse. And what I start to realize more and more is that if I want to have an influence upon my kids, if I want to be able to speak into their lives, if I want to build a relationship so that I can present the reality of what is most important in life, then I need to be willing to sacrifice many of my preferences. I need to be willing to change on a dime my methods in order to continue to speak into their lives. So what does this have to do with here, right? Here we are at church Sunday morning. The question is this. Do we see this as a reality when it comes to us as a church? Do we see the importance of the ability to make changes, to even be willing to sacrifice our preferences so that we can continue to have influence? So that we can continue to speak into people's lives, so we can continue to speak into the culture in which we live, in the community in which we live, with the relevance of Christ. My fear is that too often we become so in love with our methods, with our preferences, that we fail to change, and that we fail to see the importance of trying new things, of doing different things in order to bring this incredible message of Christ into people's lives. So what does this look like? It's actually interesting. If you go back into the Bible, you come across an individual by the name of the Apostle Paul. Now, the Apostle Paul was one of the great leaders of the early church. I would say he was the most influential person in the history of Christianity in terms of bringing forth the message of Christ. That he was one that was appointed by God to bring the message of Jesus, not to the Jewish people where it first began, but ultimately to bring it to the Gentiles, to the non-Jews. And if you're not so familiar with the Bible, the first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the Gospels, are the biographies of Jesus. And then following that, we have the beginning of the early church. That's the book of Acts. And then immediately after that, we have a whole bunch of letters that are primarily written by the Apostle Paul as inspired by God. And what we begin to see unfold is Paul's ability to reach out and to speak to those people in different cultures and different circumstances and in different situations. And this morning, I just want to look at one particular passage to the Christians in Corinth. And if you want to turn there in your Bible, you can. We're going to throw it up on the screens as well. But it's 1 Corinthians 9, and it's beginning on verse 19. And the city in Corinth was a fairly modern day city. They had challenges, they had difficulties, and Paul had lived with these individuals for 18 months. And then after the 18 months, he had left, and then he wrote letters back to them to encourage them, to answer questions they had, to have difficulties. And the overriding difficulty that the Christians in Corinth were struggling with is, how do we remain faithful to Jesus? How do we remain obedient to him, yet still be able to speak into the culture in which we live? They were struggling with the idea of that. If I'm a follower of Jesus, do I follow Jesus and then I just completely remove myself from culture? That I don't have anything to do with culture? That I just do the God and the Jesus things with the God and the Jesus people? Paul, help us out. Help us out. We're struggling. We're falling down. We're messing up. And so Paul writes this letter, and he deals with a number of different issues. But in chapter 9, we start to see, I believe, the method of Paul in telling others about Jesus. And if you want to back check it, go to the book of Acts and you see this beginning to happen. That when Paul would show up into new places, this was often the way in which he would minister. And so we're just going to pop it up on the screens here this morning. And so this is the Apostle Paul speaking. He says, "Though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like the one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak." And we're just going to leave this slide up here. He says, "I've become all things to all men, all people, so that all possible means I might save some." Now some of that's language, when he says, "I became a Jew to the Jews, I became like the law to the law." Those are the different types of individuals that he came across. But prior to this, Paul is talking about his rights, about the person that he is. But essentially what he is saying is this: we need to understand the difference between our method of ministry and the message we're proclaiming. That what Paul is brilliantly doing is he's reminding us that in different scenarios and in different situations, he would provide and engage in different methods. But the message was always the same. The message was the need for Jesus. And so he met people where they were at. The amazing thing was Paul would rarely just kind of sit back and think, well, let the people come to me. No, Paul would go into the cities. He would go into the synagogues, he'd go into the marketplaces, he would go look at their idols, he would go look at whatever the reality they were facing, and Paul would step into that. And in stepping into that circumstance, into that situation, he was able to bring the incredible message of Christ. That people were willing to listen to him because he first attempted to understand where they were coming from. I believe essentially Paul was saying, you know what? I'm willing to give up my preferences. I'm willing to give up the things that I would rather be doing, all for the sake of Christ, and so that others can hear about him. I think ultimately Paul was reminding us of the why to anything we do in his life was in order for others to hear this message of Jesus. The idea that the method can change, but the message most certainly will not. Think back to the reality of watching movies, right? Blockbuster versus Netflix. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people were watching movies. People have not stopped watching movies today. The message is people want to watch movies. What's changed is the method. As a parent, the message is I want to be able to connect with my kids. I want to be able to speak into my kids' lives. The method will change, but the message never will. When it comes to us sharing our faith, when it comes to us as a church, do we hold those same convictions? That the message of Christ is so important that we are willing to change our methods in order to reach those with the most important message of life. And that's the gospel. That's the life, that's the death, that's the resurrection of Jesus. Yet my fear, and I see this in my own life, is that we get so caught up in the method that we fail to present the message. And we will stand firm on our method. We will think, I will not change this. And as a result, we're losing our influence. As a result, we're losing our impact. And the Apostle Paul, he was not saying, you know what, I will become an adulterer to the adulterers. No, he didn't say that. I will become a thief so that people who steal will understand. No. There's that core message of Christ. That doesn't change. But when there's those disputable matters, when there are those preferences, Paul's like, I will give it all up. Even the things that I have loved, even the things that my generations before me have loved, I will give it all up in order for people to hear the message of Jesus. I think the challenge for us this morning is, are we in that place? Are we willing to embrace change? Maybe not embrace change, but understand change in such a way that others will hear about Jesus. And so what's our takeaway here this morning? What does this begin to look like? I want to suggest 3 things based on what I believe we see in the teachings of Paul and also the example of Paul. I think as a direct takeaway, we can understand this in the midst of our own life, that maybe there's an area that you are wanting to have greater influence or a greater impact. The question I would ask is this a time to change your method? You know, sometimes the greatest push for us not changing our method is we've had success in the past. That's so often the example in many places, that we've been successful in the past, and you know we're entrenched on our method when we say, well, this worked 10 years ago, or this worked 15 years ago, or this worked 20 years ago. Well, the times are a-changing. And the same way that I parented my kids 10 years ago, the methods will change, but the message isn't. So what are the 3 things? First one is this, is we must be willing to initiate with others. We take the first step. Gone are the days where we just kind of sit back and we think, okay, we've got a building, we've got a sign outside the building, we've got the time of the service on the sign outside the building. People will know to come. But when I often talk to people who've come for the first time, or even considering coming for the first time, they are intimidated by the building. They are intimidated by what exactly goes on. People don't understand. And so that's why we're constantly focusing upon going out into our community. That's why we have the initiative of For Paris. That's why we run kids camp. That's why we run sports camp. So we can go and we can meet people where they are at. They get to know who we are. And then we can have an opportunity to share the message of Christ. And so individually, are we challenged by this? This summer, do we make it a priority? Do we see it as an opportunity to go out and to get to know others, to initiate the conversations? And I am guilty of this. I am happy to engage with people when they start the conversation with me. But am I looking for opportunities? Actually, not even looking for opportunities. Oftentimes, I'm turning down opportunities because it's not what I'm comfortable with. It's not necessarily always in my wheelhouse. But I think we need to step into the reality that we need to initiate the conversations with others. The second thought is this, when it comes to change, is we need to be gracious with change. Now, this isn't a loaded conversation. There's no suddenly I'm going to drop this massive change on all of you next week, right? There's nothing in my mind. There's nothing that I'm just rolling through, right? With my luck, there will be suddenly a massive change in next week, right? But that's not the reality. But are we going to be gracious to change? And what I mean by that is it doesn't mean you can't have your preferences. It doesn't mean that you can't say, I like it this way, but are we open to trying different things? Are we open to trying new things? Are we open to the fact that the methods we're currently doing might be not the most helpful for us moving forward? Are we willing to be gracious with that? And the third one is this. Never veer from Jesus. I think we get in real problems when we start to think that in order to be relevant, In order to have influence, we need to tone down the message of Jesus. And that's not the way forward. We want to be open and clear about who we believe and why we follow. That's why our vision statement on the back of the bulletin, if you want to read it again, is we want to lead people to Jesus. Why? So that lives are transformed and our community is impacted for good. We want to see people to commit to him. We want to see people grow in him. We want to see people go with Jesus. That's our vision. That's what we're about. We're never going to veer from that. But our methods to see that happen might change. In a moment, we're going to celebrate communion. And if you've hung around this place long enough, you know that we oftentimes celebrate communion in different ways. Sometimes we have people come forward. Sometimes we have people will serve you sitting down. Sometimes we dip. Sometimes we fire it back. Different things, right? But here's the reality. The message of communion never changes. The message is about Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection. That's what it's about. We can bend on the method though, right? We can try it in different ways. That's just a perfect example of, I believe, ultimately what Paul was talking about. Is the message never changes. The message is always about Jesus. And if that is so important, then we must be willing to be a little flexible in terms of our methods of reaching others. So I invite the musicians to come up. We're gonna sing a song in a moment as we prepare for communion. And just as we come before this table, I just want to invite you to consider, are there areas in your life or is there people in your life that perhaps you need to start initiating with? Is there areas in your life that maybe there has been changes or there's going to be changes that you just need to be praying for more grace to move forward? Or maybe it's an opportunity for us to simply come and to celebrate the goodness of Jesus Christ, our Lord and our Savior. Will you stand with me if you're able?